Good afternoon to Japan from Paris, France. My name is Andy Wyckoff. I'm the Director for Science, Technology, and Innovation at the OECD. I very much regret that I cannot be in Tokyo today, but I wanted to send a video recording and PowerPoint about important work we're doing here. Let me first thank the government of Japan for the invitation to speak to you today in front of such a distinguished set, our participants and other panelists. The OECD, as I hope you know, is a multilateral intergovernmental organization based in Paris, consisting of 37 different member countries. And our motto, as you can see behind me, is better policies for better lives. Our mission is to promote the economic and social well-being of people around the world. And the OECD does this by gathering evidence, sharing policy analysis across our various tables, and setting international standards. I want to talk about all three today. I want to talk about them in a very important area, which is technology policy, in this case, artificial intelligence. Too frequently, technology advances at a speed that is far beyond the pace of policy making in our member countries. It's what I call Tech 4.0, Policy 1.0. It's important to narrow this gap so as to create a stable and predictable environment by which businesses can invest, and so as to allow policymakers to be able to shape some of these technologies to assure that they achieve societal outcomes which are beneficial to all. The OECD is assisting policymakers to fill this gap. And today, I want to present you with some examples of how we're doing it here at the OECD. And to do so, I want to share my screen and use a PowerPoint that will help me send some of the key messages to you. Now, our work on AI consists of this diagram shown here on this figure. At the center, you'll see are our AI principles. We explain those in some detail in a second. But they form the core of our work. Around it goes the Policy Observatory, which provides an evidence base for the implementation of these principles, aided by what we call the OECD Network of Experts on AI, or what we call One AI. They provide expert advice on how to implement AI policies. The OECD also hosts a secretariat for the Global Partnership on AI, what's called GPI. It was launched in June of 2020 under the leadership of France and Canada. And its purpose is to advance cutting-edge research and pilot projects on AI priorities. Japan was one of the 15 founding members of GPI. The OECD also coordinates a global parliamentary group on AI, which is a large group of legislators across the world working on AI. And last, we conduct work on a dedicated program on looking at the future of work through AI, what we call AI work on innovation, productivity, and skills, or AI WIPS. This is supported by the government of Germany. In February, just last month, we organized a very large conference online. All of the materials and videos are available at oecd.ai. And finally, we continue to work closely with a various group of different organizations. You can see them listed here: the European Commission, the G20, certainly UNESCO, UN, Council of Europe, and so forth. Now, returning to the OECD principles, these were adopted in May of 2019 at the OECD Ministerial Council meeting of that year. And they represent the first intergovernmental standard for responsible stewardship on trustworthy AI. The heritage of this work goes way back to 2016, and it goes to a town in Japan called Takamatsu, where in where the G7 ministerial was held that year, and where the first idea about producing international AI principles first emerged. In developing the AI principles at the OECD, we stepped on these principles as well as others to create an inclusive and multi-stakeholder approach to the problem. And it was this diversity of expertise which I think gives them their strength and their successful development. And to this end, I want to thank Mr. Sudo and Mr. Hirano for their important contributions to this work. In June of 2019, G20 leaders, again under the presidency of Japan, committed to use these same OECD principles. Now, this is a huge accomplishment, given the G20 accounts for at least 90% of all AI development globally. It attests the continued importance of both multilateral approach and Japan's success on leading AI policy multilaterally. On this slide, you see the 10 principles. The first 5 principles on the left are dedicated towards responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI systems. They're aimed at stakeholders involved in the AI lifecycle, including, for example, developers and designers of AI systems. The second group on the right includes recommendations for national policies and international cooperation. These are aimed at governments and what kind of policies should be put in place to promote trustworthy, responsible AI. Now, the AI principles draw on OECD's analytical work, notably the analytical report AI and Society, which was published in June of 2019, which provides a broad overview of the state of AI. And I'd like to thank Akashi Publishing for their work underway to publish a Japanese translation of this book, which I encourage you all to read. Now, as we move from principles, the challenge is implementation. The OECD leads 2 initiatives to help countries to implement these OECD principles. The first is the OECD.ai Policy Observatory and the OECD Network of Experts, Wonk AI. OECD.ai was launched a year ago, almost to this day. Our launch event included many distinguished speakers, and I wish to thank Vice Minister Yamada and the chair of our Committee on Digital Economy Policy, Mr. Ida, for their participation in this event. OECD.ai provides an online platform for multidisciplinary, evidence-based policy analysis on AI and facilitates multi-stakeholder dialogue. Its objective is to shape and share AI policy and consists of these 4 pillars here on the left. It's about the principles. It's about AI policy areas because each area has a different set of policies. It's bringing the evidence base through analyzing trends and the data. And it's about countries and their various initiatives, where we have a repository that shares these different initiatives. Let me just give you a glimpse of some of the material that's available at the observatory. The first is on trends and data. And a key priority, as I said, is to anchor policy development in evidence. This includes data and AI-powered visualizations that are available on OECD AI. For example, on this slide, you see a snapshot, a live AI-related news, where you can see real-time developments by country, in this case, Japan. And you see here is a screenshot. But if you go on to OECD.ai, you'll see the news streaming in real time. Our partner in this endeavor is the Joseph Stefan Institute from Slovenia. Another data point is live AI research using data from Microsoft's academic graph database of scientific publications, which adds about 1 million new papers per month. It shows AI research collaboration between countries and institutions. For example, this slide presents how AI collaborates with other countries on AI research. Another data point, which moving beyond news and AI research, concerns AI jobs and skills, an issue that's foremost at policymakers' mind. And here we partner with LinkedIn's Economic Graph. The figure shows the penetration of AI skills in countries with the G20 in green. The fourth, and what I consider to be one of the most important pillars of the observatory, focuses on countries and the various policy initiatives they have underway. It covers more than 60 different countries and more than 600 different policy initiatives. And I'd like to thank our Japanese national contact points at the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, MIC, who coordinate this input for Japan. Now, every country on the observatory has its own dashboard. And here you can see the AI initiatives submitted by Japan through the survey and details on each of these policies, including their budget and the responsible ministry. To facilitate knowledge sharing, OECD.ai has an AI expert blog called the AI Wonk. I really encourage you to sign up and read these blogs. It includes a recent post by Mr. Sudor on the AI utilization guidelines for the implementation of the OECD AI principles in Japan. Now, second half of my presentation, I want to dive into the implementation efforts underway to make these principles come to life. Now here, the OECD network of ASI experts is instrumental, and they're working to develop policy and implementation for the various AI principles. This network consists of a multi-stakeholder configuration of more than 200 different experts to provide policy, technical, and business input to inform the analysis and recommendations that flow into our policy committee, the Committee on Digital Economy Policy. One AI, or this network, consists of 3 working groups in a newly formed task force I'll briefly describe. The first working group is the working group on classifying AI systems, where it's developing, amongst other things, a user-friendly classification framework to help policymakers analyze what types of AI systems raise different policy issues, because AI is multivariate and different AI will raise different policy issues depending on how it's applied. The second working group is the working group on Trustworthy AI, where they're developing tools to help AI actors and decision makers implement trustworthy AI. The third working group is a working group on national AI policies, and it's developing guidance on national AI policies, such as governance of AI policies and how they are constructed across governments, how AI R&D is funded and instrumented, in the development and promotion of AI skills. As I mentioned, lastly, we'll soon launch a task force called AI Compute to better understand the computing capacity needs to innovate and develop AI. Now, I want to dedicate my remaining few minutes to a presentation on data, because data is a fundamental enabler of AI. And more broadly, it's a new resource to be captured and exploited in our current era. Here, data governance and policies for data governance, both for sharing and access of data, are critical for unlocking the value of data, including through AI. To help countries develop and implement better policy for data governance over the next 2 years, 2021 and 2022, the OECD, as a central priority, will undertake a horizontal project. And this means we engage a wide number of parts of the OECD and a wide number of different policy committees to develop a study, a project called Data Governance for Growth and Well-Being. This will be the third phase of the Going Digital project, which started in 2017. One important part of this project is the measurement and the valuation of data. I want to talk about that just briefly because I think it's fundamental. Data are increasingly a valuable asset, not only for firms, but for governments and individuals and society at large. A recent estimate and study, which I highly recommend, conducted by the Institute for Information and Communications Policy in Japan, estimates for a 1% increase in data use by Japanese firms. Firms saw an associated 0.5% increase in value added. Now, we know that data is very heterogeneous and few reliable measures exist, especially to account for the variety of different data types. The OECD has been working on this problem, and we have a recent paper out that looks at 4 different perspectives on measuring data and data flows. First is how much money firms spent on storing data. The second is how much money they make from selling different data products. The third, we use stock market valuations of data-driven firms as a proxy measure for data valuation. And finally, looking at global trade in data-intensive products, we use that as a measure of the value of data flows across borders. I'll give you some of the key figures from each of these 4 different perspectives. First, how much money are we spending on data storing? Here we identify data storage products and statistical classifications. We analyze the business's expenditure on these products. This figure shows the estimated business expenditure on data storage in the United States of America. It shows a marked growth in nominal terms from 2012 to 2017 to over $35 billion being spent in 2017. Now, in real terms, we know this number is much larger because $1 buys you much more storage capacity today than it did in 2012. The OECD is working with its member countries to develop more reliable and a wider range of statistics on this area that will cover more countries in the near future. The second perspective looks at firms' revenue from selling data products. Here we identify industries related to database compilation and distribution, as well as their various products. This figure shows the estimated business revenue from selling data products in Canada. In 2015, revenue from data products was estimated to be $1.4 billion. Now, when we look at the US and European Union, we see a similar picture, particularly relative to their GDP. For example, across the EU, estimates range between 50 and 40 billion euros being spent in 2016. Here too, we're working to improve this measure and broaden its scope to cover more countries. The idea behind the third perspective, market valuation of data-driven firms, is that data are a valuable asset to firms. And this should be reflected in the firm's market value. This figure shows the average growth and capitalization of data-driven firms between 1985 and 2020. Their market capitalization is increased by almost 120 times, translating into an average growth rate of 384% per year. This is astounding. Now, for reference, the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange indices have only grown by about 40 times over the same period. Now, again, this approach has a number of challenges and limitations which the OECD is working to address, notably how to identify what's a data-driven firm, and the fact that many startups in data-driven firms aren't even listed on the various stock markets. Finally, looking at global trade and products delivered through data flows. Here, the idea is that products are increasingly being delivered through data flows. Therefore, data flows are increasingly underpinning all of international trade. The figure shows the value of exports by firms in the sector information and communication. It does so for both the OECD and for the BRICS in 2015. The BRICS include Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, and China. In OECD countries, the information communication sector made almost $400 billion, while the BRICS countries added another $100 billion. Now, this approach as well has a number of challenges and limitations, which we're working to address. In particular, how to assess whether a product is actually being delivered digitally. That means via a data flow. Going forward, again, just more generally, the international statistical system requires significant changes and improvements and developments to measure the value of data and data flows adequately. This will take time, but we're working on it. With that, let me stop sharing my slideshow, and then by just thanking you, the participants, I very much appreciate your attention over the last 20 minutes. I want to commend Japan again for organizing this conference, but also for its leadership on AI policies, both at the OECD, but around the world. The OECD will continue its multi-stakeholder engagement and global dialogue on AI, as well as its measurement and the further development of an evidence base to better guide policy analysis in this area. We would look forward to working with you in the future to continue these policies going forward. With that, let me wish you a successful conference. Thank you very much for your attention.